Good evening. You MA Philosophy MPY 001 MGP 005 Unit number 8 Economic Inequality and Exploitation. Introduction. Discussing discussing more than 100 years ago on the text Choose Quality and Flee Greed. Matthew Arnold observed that in the world inequality is almost a religion. He remarked on the incompatibility of that attitude with the spirit of humanity and sense of the dignity of men as men, which are the marks of a truly civilized society. On the one side, in fact, inequality harms by pampering. On the other, by vulgarizing and depressing a system founded on it is against nature and in the long run breaks down. Much has changed since Arnold wrote, and not least what he called the religion of inequality, the temper which evoked his criticism, the temper which regarded violent contrast between the circumstances and opportunities of different classes, with respectful enthusiasm as a phenomenon not merely inevitable but admirable and exhilarating, if by no means extinct, is no longer vociferous. Institutions which have died as creeds sometimes continue nevertheless to survive as habits. If the cult of inequality as a principle and an ideal has declined with with the decline of the aristocratic society of which it was a component, it, it is less certain perhaps that the loss of its sentimental credential has so far impaired its practical influence as to empty Arnold's words of all their significance. It is true, no doubt, that were that were he writing today, he emphasis and illustrations would be different. No doubt, he would be less impressed by inequality as a source of torpor and stagnation, and more by inequality as a cause of active irrigation, inefficiency, and confusion. No doubt, he would say less of great landed as estates and more of finance, less of the territorial aristocracy and the social system represented by it, and more of fortunes which, however interesting their origin, are not are not associated with historic names, less of the effects of entail and settlements in preventing the wider distribution of property inland, and more of the economic forces in his day unforeseen, which have led to a progressive concentration of the control of capital, less of the reverence of worth, and more of the worship of money and economic power. But if he could be induced to study the statistical evidence accumulated since he wrote, it is probable that he would hail it as an un, unanticipated confirmation of conclusions to which, unaided by the apparatus of science, he had found his way, and while nothing with interest the inequalities which had fallen would feel even greater astonishment at those which had survived, observing the highlighted tension between political democracy and a social system marked by sharp disparities of circumstance and education, and of the opportunities with which circumstance and education confer. He would find it may be suspected in the history of the two generations since his essay appeared a more impressive proof of the justice of this diagnosis, that it fails to a lot of most prophets to receive a system founded on inequality is against nature and in a long run breaks down. Aims and objectives. After studying this unit, you should be able to understand inequality as a structural problem, justification of inequality in the mindsets midst of the inequality, liberal and Marxist views on equality and inequality, inequality as a structural problem. So to criticize inequality and to desire equality is not, as to sometimes suggested, to cherish the romantic illusion that men are equal in character and intelligence. It is to hold that while their natural endowments differ profoundly, it is the mark of a civilized society to aim at eliminating such inequalities as have their source not in individual differences but in its own organization, and that individual differences which are a source of social energy are more likely to ripen and find expression if social inequalities are as far as practicable diminished, and the obstacle to the progress of inequality is something simpler and more potent than finds expression in the familiar truism that men vary in their mental and moral as well as in their physical characteristics. Important and valuable thought, valuable though that truism is a reminder that different individuals require different type of provision. It is the habit of mind which thinks it not regrettable but natural and desirable. The different section of a community should be distinguished from each other by sharp differences of economic status, of environment, of education and culture and habit of life. It is the temper which regards with approval the social institutions and economic arrangements by which such differences are emphasized and enhanced, and feels distrust and apprehension at all attempts to diminish them. The institutions and policies in which that temper have found expression are infinite in number. At one time, it has colored the relations between the sexes, and another those between religions, at a third those between members of different races, but in communities no longer divided by religion or race, and in which men and women are treated as political and economic equals. The divisions which remains are nevertheless not insignificant. The practical form which they most commonly assume, the most conspicuous external symptom of difference of economic status and social position is of course a graduated system of social classes, and it is by softening or obliterate, obliterating not individual differences but class gradations that the historical movements directed towards diminishing inequality have attempted to attain their objective. It is therefore by considering the class system that light upon the problem of inequality is in the first place at least to be sought, and it is by their attitude to the relations between classes that the equalitarian temper and philosophy are distinguished from their opposite. The meaning of class: a society which value equality will attach a high degree of significance to differences of ca- character and intelligence between different individuals, and a low degree of significance to economic and social differences between different groups. The idea of class, most candid observers will admit, is among the most powerful of social categories. Its significance is sometimes denied on the ground that a group described as a class may, upon many an issue, be divided against itself. But this is to confuse the fact of class with the consciousness of class, which is a different phenomena. The fact creates the consciousness, not the consciousness the fact. The former may exist without the latter, and a group may be marked by common characteristics and occupy a distinctive passion vis-a-vis other groups without except at moments of exceptional intention being aware that it does so. While however class is a powerful category, it is also an ambiguous one, and it is not surpassing that there should be wide differences in the interpretations placed upon it both by sociologists and by laymen. War, the institution of private property, biological characteristics, the division of labor have all been uh, um, adduced to explain the facets of class formation and class differentiation. The diversity of doctrines is natural since the facts themselves are diverse. Clearly, there are societies in which the position and relations of the groups composing them have been determined ultimately by the effect of conquest. Clearly, the rules under which property is held and transmitted have, have played a large part in fixing the conditions by which different groups are distinguished from each other. Clearly, there are circumstances in which the biological characteristics of different groups are, are a relevant consideration. Clearly, the emergence of new social groups is a natural accompaniment of the differentiation of economic functions of the breaking up, for example, of a relatively simple and undifferentiated society into a multitude of specialized craft and professions, each with its different economic meteor, its different training and outlook and habit of life, which has been the most obvious consequence of the transition of large parts of Europe from the predominantly agriculture civilization of 2 centuries ago to the predominantly industrial civilization of today. The economic and social contours. Income may be regarded from either of 2 points of view. It may be interpreted as a product or as a dividend, as a stream of goods in process of creation, or as a stream of goods in process of consumption. And classes which rest upon economic foundations have two different aspects which correspond to them to then different aspect of the national income. They may be regarded on the one hand as composed of a series of economic groups holding different positions in the productive system, and as employer and employed, capitalist and wage earner, landlord, farmer and laborer, discharging different, if occasionally somewhat attenuated functions within it. They may be regarded on the other hand as a series of social groups distinguished from other by different standard of expenditure and consumption, and varying in their income, their environment, their education, social status and family connections, their leisure and their amusements. When attention is turned upon the organization of industry and the relations of the various interests engaged in it, their disputes, their agreements, their attempts to establish more effective cooperation, and and their failure to achieve it, it is naturally the first aspect of the class system which springs into prominence. Society is regarded as an economic mechanism, the main element of whose structure correspond to different classes. In the discussion of the tradition, habits, and manner of life by which different classes are characterized, the social institutions with which they have created, the types of schools which they attend, the varying environments in which they live, and the feature which attracts attention is naturally the second. Society then presents itself not as a productive machine but as an orga, organism composed of groups with varying standard of life and culture. The class system takes off its overall or office coat or and wears the costume appropriate to how to hours of ease. Before goods can be consumed, goods must be produced. It is obvious that these two aspects of social organization are closely connected, as overs and rivers, or flower and root. The material fabric of civilization is always crumbling and always being renewed. The wealth which renews it is heaven daily in the gloom of mind and fashion unceasingly in the glare of the forge. Both the hierarchy of the world of leisure, therefore, and the hierarchy of the world of productive efforts has its common foundation in the character and organization of the economic system. But while they have a common foundation, the lines of the one are not a mere replica of those of the other. They correspond, but they do not coincide. And in old societies, indeed, they coincide less closely than in younger communities, where the action of economic forces are on structure of society encounters fewer breakwaters built by tradition, and are therefore more simple, immediate, and direct. The social fabric is stretched upon an economic framework, and is contours follow the outlines of the skeleton which supports it, but it is not strained so taut as to free from superfluous fold and ornamental puckers, molded as it was on the different structure of the past. It has not always it has not always adjusted itself with nicety to the angels of the present, equality and culture. It is not surprising that varieties of class organization should be but inadequately represented in the terminology of social sciences, but the absence of a word to describe the type of society which combines the form of political democracy with sharp economic and social divisions is nonetheless unfortunate, since it obscures the practical realities which it is essential to grasp. The conventional classification of communities by the character of their constitutional arrangements had its utility in an age when the principal objective of effort and speculation was the extension of political rights. It is economic and social forces, however, which are most influential in determining the practical operation of political institutions, and it is economic and, and social relations that create the most urgent of the internal problems in confronting industrial communities. The most significant differences distinguishing different societies from each other are, in short, not different form of constitution and governments but different types of economic and social structure. Of such distinctions, the most fundamental is that which divides communities where economic initiative is widely diffused and class differences is small in dimensions and trivial in their effects from those where the conditions obtaining are the opposite, where the mass of mankind exercise little little influence on the direction of economic enterprise, and where economic and cultural gradations dis, uh, descend precipitously from one stratum of the population to another. Both types may possess representative institutions, a wide franchise, and responsible government, and both therefore may properly be described as democracies. But to regard them as on that account resembling each other, to ignore the profound differences of spirit and quality between a democracy in which class divisions play a comparatively unimportant part in the life of society, and a democracy where the influence of such differences is all pervasive, is to do violence to realities. Egalitarianism, justification for equality in the mind's midst of inequality. An understanding of the meaning of egalitarianism is necessary in order to grasp the correct nature of the ideal of equality. Here, it means that equality is no substitute for uniformity. After all, equality is a matter of derivate value. It is derived from the supreme value of the development of personality in each alike and equality, but in each along its own separate notion. That is, the principle of equality needs to be adjusted to the values of men's functional capacity. When the primary needs of all men are met, the differences they encounter must be differences. Their function requires requirement involving always the context of social benefit, that is, what is derived by a man must not divert or defeat the source from which it comes, in view of the fact that any equality that spelled uniformity would necessarily divert and defeat the spontaneous development of all the varieties of human personality. Again, equality in all its forms must always be subject and instrumental to the free development of capacity. But if it is pressed to the length of uniformity, and if uniformity be made to thwart the free development of capacity, the subject becomes the master and the world is turned topsy turvy. In other words, the idea of equality is more of a prescriptive than of a descriptive nature. Therefore, the simple aphorism that all men are equal simply means that they should be treated alike in their fundamental traits common to all, like their dignity and worth as human beings, and not that they all possess attributes or capacities in an equal measure. In the world of medical sciences, all patients cannot be treated with the same medicine. Likewise, in the world of jurisprudence, the theft and murder cannot be treated as identical crimes deserving equal punishment. Therefore, it is hardly desirable that all men should be treated equally in all aspects. Thus, understand the principle of equality does not prescribe positively that all human beings be treated alike. It is presumptions against treating them differently in any respect until grounds for distinction have been shown. It does not assume, therefore, a quality which all men have to the same degree, which is the ground of the presumptions. For to say that there is a presumption means that no grounds need be shown. In this direction, we may refer especially to the work of Hugo Bedu, who reminds us that to think as an egalitarian is to consider a range of all inequalities and to explore ways to remove or at least diminish them. He lays down seven propositions to explain his thesis in the following manner. There is the principle of radical egalitarianism, which seek to abolish differences on the plea that all social inequalities which are unnecessary and unjustifiable ought to be eliminated. There is the principle of metaphysical egalitarianism, which treats all persons as equal now and forever in intrinsic value, inherent worth, essential nature. There is the principle of ethical radicalism, which holds natural inequality as a law of nature and also based on recognizable and accepted human differences. There is the principle of social Number four, there is the principle of social radicalism. It suggests that social qualities need no special justification, whereas social inequality always do. Number five, there is the case for pragmatic radicalism, which informs that all persons are to be treated alike except where circumstances require different treatment. Number six, there is the principle of scientific radicalism, which informs that though some social inequalities are necessary, and even if equal conditions are granted, the fact of inherent inequalities sooner or later will break through. Number seven, there is a principle of die-hard radicalism, which is based on the assumptions that in view of the complexity of every social organization, some factors of social inequalities are definitely justifiable. Bedu thus confidently concludes these principles remain as the quadrants of social justice, equalitarian instruments for social criticism and reform. Instead of radical egalitarianism, what we are left which is the universal principle that all social inequalities not necessary or justifiable should be eliminated. In fine, equality is an empty idea if it studies in a purely abstract or isolated sense. It has content when it is particularized. That is, it should be studied in the context of actual things. In this sense, it implies that equals should be treated equally and unequals unequally, and the respect in which they considered unequal must be relevant to the differences in treatment that are under specific consideration. If there is a norm that equal pay should be given for equal work, it is also needed that work done should be equally well. Thus, a conscientious follower of the English liberal thought like Professor I- Isaiah Berlin feels that though the ideal limit or idealized model at the heart of the egalitarian thought is a society in which not only will everyone be treated alike, but in which natural differences will have been ignored out. But that when the pursuit of equality comes into conflict with other human aims, it is only the most fanatical egalitarian who will demand that such conflicts invariably be decided in favor of equality bill with relative disregard for other values concerned. Ideal of equality, liberal versus Marxist views. The idea of equality carries different implications to the men of liberal and Marxist views. The idea of equality, according to liberal notion, is equals should be treated equally, unequals unequally, and the respect in which they are considered unequals must be relevant to the differences in treatment that we propose. It is, however, a different matter that with the assimilation of socialist content in the philosophy of liberalism, the real meaning of equality has been integrated with the consideration of social good, as a result of which the concept of social equality has become all pervasive. Keeping it in the view, John Rawls suggests two essential points inherent in the notion of equality. First, each person is to have an equal right to the extensive basic liberty compatible with similar liberty for others. Second, social and economic inequalities are to be arranged so that they are both reasonably expected to be everyone's advantage and be attached to position and offices equally open to all roles. The liberal doctrine of equality, strictly speaking, stands on the premise of the equality of adequate opportunities available to every man in what Macpherson calls a market society, now turned into quasi-market society, that is, let all people have liberty to compete with each other in the midst of equal opportunities, with the result that those who can make best use of their chances may go ahead of others. Inequality in the minds in the midst of equal opportunities is thus a valid affair. The doctrine of equality, the doctrine of equality of opportunity is the product of a competitive and fragmented society. A society in which individualism is the reigning ethical principle. It is a precise symbolic expression of the liberal bourgeois model society, for it extends the marketplace mentality to all the sphere of life. It views the whole of human relations as a contest in which each man competes with his fellows for scarce good, a content resting upon the attractive convention that all should be allowed to improve their conditions as far as their abilities permit. Basically, opposed to it the Marxist notion of equality. If examined closely, the concept of equality, according to Marxist notion, has only two aspects: economic in the socialist and humanistic in the communist phases of social development. That is what we call equality has mainly an economic aspect, so long as we live in a class or a classless society. It shall have a humanistic form when the era of final stage of socialism ushers in with the withering away of the state. There can be no equality so long as there are class contradictions, unless capitalism is thoroughly liquidated in the period of transition by the dictatorship of the proletariat. There can be nothing like real equality. The existence of equality is naturally bound up with the true application of the rule. He who shall work shall eat. It shows that Marx's sovereign concept was on economic equality. His life and writings are glorious epitaph on that. For after all, it is economic injustice and economic exploitation that have characterized the whole course of human history. Since economics plays a decisive part in the determination of the relations of production, naturally, it is the pro- propertied class that possesses and control the level or levers of power. All benefit of liberty and equality are shared by the class of the haves, while the classes of have-nots suffers from the pangs of slavery or servitude. How can a poor worker make use of equal opportunities in the competition with the sons of the rich? How can a worker successfully compete when his rival is a member of the capitalist class? The provision of the equal opportunity is thus a hoax. Whatever rational jurisdiction rational justification may be behind it. Lenin's analysis thus stands on this assumption that no democratic order is possible within the framework of capitalism, for the capitalist class is far too strong and uses the political power symbolized in the state for the preservation of its own interest and to fasten the bonds of enslavement on the workers and peasants. Equality thus comes to prevail when the classless society is established after the successful results of the revolution. All kinds of equality, social, economic, legal, and political, merge so as to prove that equality is possible only after the liquidation of class antagonism. All persons engaged in work, whether mental or physical, belongs to the class of the toilers and intelligentsia that shows the existence of a new kind of collective life. The organic unification in a one classes collective of all workers means an end to dividing society, will be a society of peaceful creative labor, equality and happiness of all people. This will be a society where for the first time in history the personality of each worker will attain a full, general and perfect development. The Marxist notion of equality assumes a humanistic form in the final stage of social development. That is, the existence of equality will merge with the with the prevalence of glorious human values. When the state withers away and people come to lead a life of perfect cooperation, it is in such an ideal state that Rousseau's concept of moral equality shall prevail. Though a critic of Rousseau's abstract man, Marx appreciates the doctrine of moral equality in that ideal stage of human existence, and the notion of abstract man entitled for moral equality will have a concrete form. As he says, human emancipation will only be complete when the real individual man has absorbed into himself the abstract citizen, when as an individual man in his everyday life, in his relationship, he has become a species being, and when he has recognized and organized his powers as social powers, so that he no longer separates in this social power himself as a political power. Egalitarianism and scientific value, relativism, empirical determination of inequality and exploitation. Equality is mainly a normative concept, implying that though all persons should have equal opportunities, yet all wills are not to be weighted equally. As such, uh, as such, the principle of egalitarianism is not only an ideal; it is to be understood in a certain context. Moreover, the norm of equality does admit scope for differentiation or certain legitimate grounds. As such, any idea of equality giving no room for the prevalence of discrimination shall amount to its contradiction. A positive egalitarianism demanding similar treatment of all, irrespective of any difference, would clearly lead to absurdities. To sweep away all distinctions would be to commit injustices as inexcusable as any under attack. Moral progress is made as much by making new and justifiable distinctions as by eliminating established but irrelevant inequalities. The pertinent question that arises at this stage is how the idea of equality, being a non scientific phenomena, can be studied in empirical terms, or how can a purely normative term be scientifically determined. In other words, it is generally understood that an ethical or a political ideal implying that in spite of all artificial differences, all human beings should be treated as essentially equal is necessarily beyond the scope of inter-subjective verifiability. An appropriate answer to such a query is that the concept of equality or the principle of egalitarianism should be understood in a different light. If so, we shall arrive at a different conclusion and thereby find ourselves poles apart from one like Leonard Nelson, who, in explicit word, recognized that merely logical proof of ethical norm was impossible. Perhaps Harvard Uh, is Spiegelberg made a better assessment in his paper titled A Defense of Equality when he visualized that sometimes the 18th century argument that all men ought to be treated equally on the ground that they were born equal is still heard today in somewhat more precise form that equal treatment is evidently required on the ground that all men are by birth in the same plight because they had no influence on whether they were born at all born at all into what conditions they were born and from whom they descended. Such a way of arguing as Brecht Brecht said supplies a forceful emotional appeal but no scientific proof that only equal treatment of all human beings in just unless we have previously accepted a measure premise to the effect that all those who are born into the same plight ought to be treated equally. As such, the principle of equality can be adjudged, tested, evaluated, even determined in certain empirical terms where possible and not in all in as much as even the scope of scientific inquiry is not unlimited. Thus, science may not prove, although reason may teach, an ethical violation may accept that on this ground all men are essentially equal. The absolute value of this one feature cannot be ascertained by scientific method, and if ascertained on the basis of intuition or any other source, its validity cannot be intersubjectively verified. As such, the ideal of equality may be subjected to empirical determination in these respects. Number one, it may be verified that all men not only distinguish between good and evil but also are subject to some inner urge towards the ideal. Only equal cases are to be treated equally. Science can continue to explore the connections or the lack of interconnections between physical and mental or moral traits or to refute unscientific uh, contentions as to racial differences in this respect. Further, science can do psychological and phenomenological research on the manner in which men become aware of equalities and inequalities, real or imaginary. For instance, in the relations between in groups or out group individuals. As such, it can distinguish various mutually incompatible yardsticks of equal treatments like those of needs or abilities and point to the impossibilities of establishing full equality. It follows that the principle of natural equality in some and of natural inequality in some other respect is accepted by science. If so, the ideal of equality is necessarily accompanied by by a set of distinctions that should be valid or legitimate. The real meaning of the principle of egalitarianism that only equals can be treated equally or uh, and that all men cannot be treated identically regardless of conscious consequences is a scientifically tenable proposition. The only requirement is that the grounds of discrimination should be legitimate and can be empirically tested and evaluated. Thus, it shall be a scientifically valid statement to offer that while a distinction on the basis of color or creed in respect of the recruitment to public services shall be scientifically wrong. Discrimination on the basis of sex in the requirement of defense personnel shall be scientifically valid. It can be verified scientifically that while the prevalence of equality leads to political stability, its absence results in mass discontent. By all means, science can predict the consequences and risk entailed by flagrant discriminations from feelings hurt to violent uprisings. Thus, Aristotle was perfectly right in holding that the cause of sedition lay in inequality. We are thus driven to this conclusion that the ideal of equality has both normative and empirical dimensions, and as such, it can be determined by religious, ethical, or non-scientific measures in some cases, and by empirical or scientific yardsticks in others. Critical appreciation. We what we have What we have said in the preceding What we have said in the preceding sections lead to a certain definite impressions. First, equality implies equal opportunities for all without artificial or unwarranted discrimination. Second, if there are certain lines of distinction, they should be legitimate. Third, equality has both normative and empirical dimensions. Though mainly a normative concept, it can be measured in empirical terms in certain respects. Fourth, the ideal of equality is not anti anth- antithetical, but complementary to the ideal of liberty. Above all, there can be no liberty in the absence of economic equality. It may, however, be added that the concept of equality is still a victim of certain misconnotations. It not only makes the issue of its reconciliation with liberty a very complex affair, but also creates a problem of its proper understanding. Two important points may be made in this connection. Firstly, though the history of the development of the ideal of equality is quite old, and by now every believer in the system of democracy has come to believe that it is one of the two pillars of popular government, the other being liberty, he is not prepared to define or explain its real meaning in the direction of bringing about its plausible reconciliation with the ideal of liberty. Nothing, nothing but the consideration of vested interest stands in the background. The shrewd attempt to several liberal thinkers in the direction of first, though willy-nilly accepting the case for the reconciliation of equality with liberty, and then endeavoring to solve the problem in their own dexterous way, not only snacks of intellectual dishonesty on their part, but also shows their vested interest in maintaining the status quo to any possible extent, so that their vested interests do not suffer in a thoroughgoing manner. The result is that till now a universally acceptable definition of the term equality remains the need of the hour. Secondly, the problem has been made more complex by the Marxists who find no equality until a classless society is established. One may wonder how there can be equality in the minds of no liberty during the era of the dictatorship of the proletariat. Though we may fully appreciate the view of Marx and Lenin that unless all have economic freedom, there is neither liberty nor equality. We may also ask as to what sort of liberty remains when the political system in a established ruthlessly uh, a regimented order. The developments in the dismantling of erstwhile Soviet Union bears its testimony to it. Would it not be correct to say that there is hardly any fundamental difference between liberal democratic and communist orders in this respect, in view of the fact that while the former ensures liberty at the expense of equality, the latter brings about equality at the expense of liberty. Summary: we are still in search of finding a proper and universally acceptable version of the real meaning of equality and its proper reconciliation with liberty. What we have is just a workable arrangements, more or less of a normative character. Differences in the social, political, and economic philosophies of the people shall continue so long as there is economic inequality and exploitation. With it, differences in the real meaning of equality shall continue so as to defy the problem of any standard solution to the problem of giving rigid and precise connotations of this great value of human life. At the same time, the tendency of taming the brute shall continue, so that authority being a political trust remains a representative, and for this reason a responsible affair. It has by now been well established that inequality is an artificial contrivance that ought to be eradicated if liberty and equality are to survive in a harmonious manner. Economic liberty and the political authority should be redevised in a way that there is a equalization of power and wealth having its healthy and constructive effect on the moral and intellectual capacities of human beings. The goal should be achieved without sacrificing the individual or his personality. Russell says the greatest political evil is not inequality of wealth, as the Bolshevik theorists insist, but inequality of power. Thank you.